where history's shadows cast long, unsettling doubts, the truth lies buried. From cryptic wartime codes to assassinations that scarred generations, unearth the secrets the world tried to forget. Host Tim Gardner guides you through a labyrinth of unanswered questions where every clue pulses with danger and intrigue, and perhaps an opinion or two. It's not all facts because history never is. Welcome to the Ciphered Past.
All right, everybody, welcome to a new episode of Ciphered Past, episode 12. I'm your host, Tim Gardner. With me this evening, I have Eli Frame. Eli, you want to say hi to everybody?
Hey, it's good to be here. I appreciate it, Tim.
Yeah, and tonight we got a really special guest. We've been looking forward to this episode. And he is one of America's most respected film historians, author of major biographies on Spielberg, Capra, Ford, and Welles, who also spent 30 years investigating the JFK Tippit murders. He's got a wide resume of just work that is incredible, which we will talk about in this show. And we're honored to have the great Joe McBride with us this evening. Thank you, Joe.
No, thank you, Tim and Eli. It's great to be with you guys, and I really appreciate the good words.
Now, your latest book is called "I Loved Movies, But," and it's a conversation with Dennis Peary. And this book, in general, is just—it's not only a reflection, but it's also about just how you've been able to kind of view things through your life in studying movies and things that you absolutely love. Why don't you give our audience just a little bit of a synopsis about um, just about your reaction about when the book came out and how it came out and how you feel about it.
It's new. It just came out about 10 days ago. It was fun doing it. It took about a year's work with my old college friend, Danny Perry, who's a well-known author of books about movies and baseball. And I was a baseball fanatic when I was a kid, and my first book is on baseball. It's Hein Inside, The Complete Guide to Baseball Slang, which I started writing in high school. Danny has done books on. Collaborated on biographies of Gil Hodges and Roger Maris that are really good, and he worked with Ralph Kiner on his memoirs. But he's also written books such as 3 cult movies books that are really delightful, and he has a cult following of his own. So he was fun to talk to, and he and I, we're about the same age, and went to school together at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which was a great place to become a cinephile in the late '60s. And we were what was called the Madison Film Mafia. There were about 25 of us, guys and girls, who became either filmmakers or film scholars or both. Film teachers, film scholars. The most famous filmmaker who came out of that group was Errol Morris, great documentary filmmaker, who's remained a good friend of mine over the years. And some important film historians like David Bordwell and Danny's brother Jerry Perry and Michael Wellington, who I co-wrote a book with John Ford with. And but the chance to do this memoir was offered to me by Paul Cronin, who is a good film historian, and he started his own boutique company called Sticking Place Books, and he's published a lot of really interesting, kind of esoteric film books, some by filmmakers and some in a series that he's started on film critics and historians like myself, doing interviews about their lives. And when I was starting out, it was a big thing to interview directors. I did a lot of published interviews, Q&A format with directors. And so that was one way we kind of learned about film. We'd go to directors we admired and ask them to tell their stories. And I published a whole book of interviews with Howard Hawks that I did, Hawks on Hawks. And Paul said, you could do this yourself or you could get an interviewer. And he recommended I get an interviewer. He thought it would make it more lively, which it did. And I thought of Danny because a few years ago, he interviewed me a couple times for a publication back in New York. And his questions were very thorough and very knowledgeable and very sympathetic. I found I've been in a lot of documentary films too, excuse me, and I found that the best interviews I've done are the ones where I feel most comfortable with the interviewer, and there are a couple in particular. My friend Julie Kergo on Becoming John Ford, and Sam Pollard on a PBS documentary about John Ford and John Wayne. And sometimes, the interviewee situation is a little awkward, and that does you don't open up as much. I mean, and I've interviewed so many people in my life. I once estimated I've interviewed about 15,000 people because I've been a newspaper reporter. I've been a journalist since 1960, and when I was a reporter, full time reporter on regular newspapers and then on daily variety, all day long you're interviewing people, and then for my books on film, I've interviewed hundreds of people. Excuse me, I have a bit of a cold these days, but hopefully get through this fine. But I've learned how to interview people, but I've been interviewed more than interviewing, which is kind of strange. As you get older, I guess you get treated like an expert, and you. I enjoy that process too. I kind of miss interviewing people though, but so it was very comfortable and a lot of fun. And I told Danny, please prod me and provoke me and challenge me, and we went through the whole gamut of different kinds of questions. This took a year. We did it by email because he lives in New York and I live in California, and that's made it real easy to collaborate. It was very pleasant. I'll mention that I was down on collaboration because when I did my book on John Ford with Mike Wilmington back in the late 60s, early 70s, it was very difficult. He was a brilliant actor and writer who became an important film reviewer for the Chicago Tribune and the LA Times. And he was really good at that, but he wasn't good at writing a long form book. It takes a lot of discipline and stick to itivity, to use an old word from the Mickey Mouse Club, I guess. And so we had a lot of clashes on that book. It was very difficult to get that book finished. And I had to finally fire him and say, I'm either going to drop this whole project after a year and a half, or I will finish it on my own and we'll share credit. So he would write, we broke the book up into chapters that I thought I would be good at this film and he'd be good at that film. But he would write a draft and it would have some wonderful stuff in it, but then parts of it would be not good or messy. And so I'd say redo it, but he would lose some of the good stuff. He'd add some new good stuff, and then there'd be some new bad stuff. So basically, I had like 5 drafts of every chapter from Mike, and I had to spend 6 months rewriting all that stuff. And he later told me, he said, I didn't want that book to end because I knew that you would go on to do a lot of books, and I wouldn't, and I wanted to prolong the situation, which is not a healthy situation. We actually had a couple of fistfights as a result of this. It became ridiculous. It's kind of, like John Ford movies always have brawls. and they're comical brawls, and the brawls we had were kind of comical when you look back on them, but at the time, it was upsetting. But anyway, the book came out, and it turned out very well, and we're proud of it, and I did an updated edition. Mike died a couple of years ago, but I had always wanted to update it and bring it back into print, and I added some new appendices on some topics that are still controversial about Ford, his view of race, his view of Irishness, his view of comedy, etc., his use of comedy. And I did a long new edition on his silent films, because a lot of silent films have come out that we didn't know about at the time. They weren't hadn't been rediscovered. So I did this new edition, and but I was down on collaboration. I thought I'll never collaborate again with anybody, and but Danny, I felt, okay, I could do that because he's reliable. He's done as many books as I have. I think we've each done 25 books. It's a lot of books, and he's a real pro, and so it was a pleasure working with him all the way through.
Well, tell us, Joe, about the title. I loved movies, but so when did that come to you? And then explain the but.
It's partly an allusion to one of my favorite directors, Ozu, the great Japanese director. He made some movies with wonderful titles. The most wonderful title was "I Was Born, but dot dot dot" 1936 comedy. He made about two little kids. It's just a great movie. He also made one about college life called "I Flunked, but," you know, and there's something just kind of fascinating and enigmatic about those titles. And so I kind of thought about that, but I did a book. I think it was in 2017, called Two Cheers for Hollywood, which is a big collection of my short works. I put together the ones that I thought were best. And I wrote a long introduction called "I Love Movies, But," and I ended with slightly different variation. "Yes, I love movies, but dot dot dot." And in between, I talked about my four different careers that I've had, which is sort of the organizing principle of this book too. I'm somewhat unusual in the film critic world because I've been a journalist since 1960, when I sold my first article when I was 12 to a national kids magazine, school magazine, and I've been a book author since 1963. I was a screenwriter, film and television writer, in Hollywood for 10 years, and I wrote scripts for about eight or 10 years before I sold one. And I've also been a teacher. I was a professor at San Francisco State University in the School of Cinema for 22 years. I just retired a year ago. And so I've had these four overlapping careers, and they cross fertilize each other. They all help a lot. And I think that's been a real boon to my writing of film books, for example, and also the writing of books on the Kennedy assassination is really my main interest in life has always been the Kennedy assassination since it happened. Even before it happened, I wrote an article, a short story about it in 1961, 2 years before it happened, for my high school freshman English class at Marquette University High School in Milwaukee. I wrote a short story called "The Plot Against the Country," imagining what would happen if Kennedy was shot. And I think I wrote that because I was a volunteer on his 1960 Wisconsin presidential primary campaign, and I got to meet him twice during that time and talk to him in one very intimate gathering 2 blocks from our house. My mother was involved in the campaign. She was vice chairman of the state party a year later, but she was involved in his campaign, and she got me into it. And she set up a little rally called Kids for Kennedy at Wauwatosa City Hall, which is the suburb we lived in. And Kennedy came over a lunch hour, and the audience was like 100 kids and mothers, basically, and it was very nice. And we got to chat with him. I answered a question. He asked a question about profiles in courage, which I had just read in preparation for his visit, and my hand shot up and I answered the question. He asked about three senators he'd written about, and I said, Webster, Clay, and Calhoun. And he said, I hope I don't have to run against you in 1964, which the most flattering thing I've ever been told. It was so nice. And then afterwards, he kind of mingled with the kids, and I remember one of my little brothers kept crawling between his legs as he was standing there chatting and shaking hands with us and stuff. And so he was very, real to me, very human. And then I met him at a big rally 4 days later, the biggest rally of the campaign, right before it ended. It's in the movie Primary, which is a really good documentary about that. And so it became a landmark cinema verite documentary. And the big rally in Milwaukee, 3,000 people, and I'm in that crowd. And I took a photo of him. I had a little brownie camera. I took a lot of pictures that night, but I rather rudely put my camera 3 feet from his face and blew off a flashbulb in his face. And he looked suitably stunned, but he recovered very quickly. He was very adept at campaigning and he broke into a smile. But I immediately felt really embarrassed at how rude I was to do that. And, but he recovered. And that's why the picture is out of focus. It's in my book. It's a good portrait, but it's out of focus. And I think I realized in both cases he didn't have much security. In the Wauwatosa event, I didn't see any security. He came with, I think, one aide and a reporter, might have been Theodore White, who was tagging along with him. That was it. No security. And in Milwaukee, when you look at the films, you see a few policemen around, but they weren't very close to him. And here I was blowing something off in the guy's face. So I think it made me worry about him, and I wrote this piece. I was into the Lincoln assassination as a subject of study as a kid. It was the 100th anniversary of the Civil War. There was a lot of talk about that, and so I got into studying the Civil War, and I was fascinated by the Lincoln killing, and I knew that it would probably be a plot. Once in a while there is a lone shooter that happens to get close to the president, but it's actually kind of hard to do. But in the Lincoln case, it was a conspiracy, and so I imagine what would happen to Kennedy. It was kind of what you fear the most. So when he was shot, I wasn't completely surprised, but we could talk about the effect on me. But so I think you asked me why the title. I veered off. As I just said, Kennedy assassination is my main interest in movies, or my avocation, I would say, even though I've earned my living as a film teacher and film journalist and author of film books. I don't write books for money particularly. They're not, the kind of books that sell a lot. And also, I often pour my own money into these books. That's why I don't write biographies anymore, because they're so expensive. You never get enough advance to write the book the way that you think you should. So I would subsidize these books with my savings or whatever I could earn while I was writing them. And I would always go way into debt every time I did a biography, and I realized I just can't afford to do those. So I now write critical studies of directors, which it doesn't entail as much traveling, which is the big expense when you're doing a book. Um, but movies were my passion from college onward. I was going to be a journalist and novelist until I saw Citizen Kane in 1966 in a film class in Madison. And it changed me, and I immediately thought I'll become a filmmaker and write about films. And I was inspired by the fact that Orson Welles had made this great film when he was only 24, and he was another kid from Wisconsin, which inspired me. And I started writing a book about him because I went out to try to find one, and I couldn't find a good one. And so I wrote a book about him. That's usually why I write a book, is I feel there's a need for it. And I didn't realize that he had lived just right around the corner from where I wrote the book, in a student rooming house. He spent a year in Madison when he was 10. The only time he went to public school, he was staying with a university teacher. His mother had died, and his father was an alcoholic, and they kind of farmed him out into, well, he went to a private boys' school after that, but he spent a year in Madison, not very happy. But right around the corner from where I was writing the book is kind of spooky. Um, so I was really into movies, and I started teaching myself how to write screenplays because I couldn't find a book about it, and we didn't have a course on how to write screenplays, so I taught myself. And then I went to Hollywood. I had this dream that I would be a writer director, and I write at great length about my disillusioning experiences in Hollywood. That it was not the industry that I thought it was. I mean, I kind of was under the delusion that it would be like the days of John Ford and Frank Capra and those great directors who I admired from the 30s and 40s, and I think I would have been happy in the studio system, even though it had a lot of drawbacks, but it had a lot of positive things too. That, like today, I feel sorry for a lot of my friends who didn't get out of the film business like I did because it's really difficult. The film business in LA, especially, it's very hard to make a living now. And I could see the signs back in the 80s that things were going to hell. But the industry was quite different from what I expected, and I was had I did pretty well as a screenwriter considering. In 10 years, I had two movies made, one of which, Rock and Roll High School, that I co-wrote, became a cult classic, and that's pretty good. People still love that movie. And another one I wrote, Blood and Guts, was a Canadian film. I spent 5 years on it, and then the producer killed the movie to get a tax advantage because if the movie flopped, he would write it off his taxes. So I wasted 5 years on that. But I also wrote 9 TV specials or documentaries. So it's pretty good amount of work in 10 years. But I did a lot of scripts that didn't get filmed too, some of which I sold, but they didn't get made. And that's par for the course for screenwriters today. They write a lot of projects that don't get filmed. But that frustrated me a lot because when I write a book, it gets published, and I think the whole experience of writing a screenplay that you really care about that doesn't go anywhere is terribly frustrating. And then I was pretty naive when I went to Hollywood too. I've always been a kind of a trusting, honest kind of guy, but you know, my naivete was my Achilles heel, and I kind of thought people were trustworthy, and I had this illusion that they were all there because they love movies, and that was a big shock to find out that's not the reason most people are in the film business. They're in it for the money and the sex and the power. Those are all related things. Not because they want to make good movies, but there are a few people who do. But I had a lot of bad experiences, but I had the sense to bail out of it and go into writing books full time because I realized I enjoy writing books, and you're kind of the boss. You're like the studio chief when you write a book, and you have control. You have a lot more legal rights and more. It's not you're not answering to other people except your editor and publisher, and that can be a problem too. But I've been much happier since then. But writing screenplays and learning about the industry in the trenches, and also I was a reporter for Daily Variety trade paper. I really learned about the industry that way, and that helped me immensely writing biographies of great filmmakers because I really understood what they went through to make films, and it helps me with my critical studies too. So I think that was a valuable experience, but I had the sense to get out of it before it ate me up. So when I say I loved movies, I think I mean that I loved them in a kind of naive, delusional way. I still like movies. I still watch movies. The other day I watched 3 Douglas Sirk movies I had never seen before. I kind of get into a certain director, and then I thought, well, hey, I found 3 Sirk films, so I must be a film fan if I'm doing that kind of thing. But I don't want to make movies anymore.
Hmm. Well, the book is called I Loved Movies But, and you can pick it up on stickingplacebooks.com. The author of it, Joseph McBride, with Conversations with Dennis Perry, is with us. And Joe, just about the book in general, I mean, there's so much to talk about it, but is it more about movies or is it about lifelong consequences of loving them, in your opinion?
Yeah, really good question. I think it's about the consequences. It's not a, autobiography in the sense that I'm writing about all the ups and downs of my private life. Some of that comes into it when it affects my career, but it's about my work. And I tried to make it entertaining to, by telling inside stories about what went into the writing of each book or each film project and my adventures and misadventures. Try to make it fun. When I was working on it, I remembered that several people over the years had said, "Joe, you tell such interesting stories about your time in the movie business. You really ought to do a book of your stories." I didn't really take them seriously because it sounded kind of amorphous. But when I tell my life story as a um, writer, then it gives a good framework to go into all these things. And so it is about the life of a writer. And I like reading biographies of writers, by the way. I always find them interesting because I like to know how they support themselves, for one thing, and the struggles they had to do certain books and um, the adventures and misadventures along the way and problems and successes. And so I think of writing as a kind of war. Life is kind of a war, and that Nietzsche quote, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger." I think that's really true of my life. It's funny when I wrote about what books I was influenced by as a kid. One of them may seem odd to people. Richard Nixon's memoir, Six Crises, which came out in 1962, always was a book that fascinated me. I'm very anti-Nixon in terms of his political views. I hardly agree with. I mean, actually, he had a few views that weren't too bad, but he was a Shakespearean tragic character, as we all know, a fascinating character who destroyed himself basically, and or was destroyed. It's a complex situation, but in his '62 memoir, which he wrote when he was in the political wilderness, he covers his life in terms of six big crises that he had. And I like that kind of melodramatic way of looking at your life as a series of crises to overcome. And I've kind of had that. I've counted seven now that I would consider. And I've managed to win each time. Just one that I write about in detail because it really had a big effect on my life was I had an insane nun in third grade who abused me. Um, she locked me in the closet once with all the kids pushing the door. That was very traumatic, and I angered her for reasons that I had no idea why. But she gave every girl in the class one of those long wooden rulers that nuns all have, and told them to hit me over the head every time I misbehaved. They could walk past my desk, and so all the first semester I was hit on the head constantly by these girls. Crazy stuff. And but I survived that year with the nun, and I basically helped drive the nun to a mental hospital. I'm proud of that achievement. Actually, what happened was there were some nice girls in the class who didn't participate, and one of them, a nice girl named Mary Sturl, started crying one night when her mother was giving her a bath, and she said that the nun is abusing Joe, and a girl in the class was also being abused. And so the mothers started talking, and they realized because I never told my parents that this was going on because I was afraid they would blame me. This is kind of the upbringing that I had. That was somehow my fault. I didn't say, this is what's going on. But the mothers started talking and they went to the pastor and the nun got shipped off to the mental hospital. But the damage was done. But, I always sort of prevail in these things. I think it's because of this Catholic masochism that I learned as a kid. that I can endure a lot of abuse and grief. And I survived the Hollywood experience. That's another trauma, but it made me better. And I mentioned that it really informed my understanding of the industry and the Catholic experience. I also I had a nervous breakdown, a physical and psychological breakdown when I was in high school, and it was partly due to overwork. I mean, it was probably mostly due to overwork in high school. I went to a very rigorous Jesuit boys' high school, which was a great school, except there we had a priest who would whip our rear ends with a sawed-off metal golf club if we misbehaved, and there's that kind of stuff going on. And also the amount of homework was inhuman, like 4 hours every night, and I became anorexic, and I was going through all kinds of anguish about sexuality, as a teenager would do. But I felt guilt because of the Catholic upbringing, etc. And so I cracked up in the middle of my senior year, and I started being kind of delusional, and I was put in a mental hospital for 4 months. And that was really the best thing that ever happened to me, because I got out of my house, which was a dysfunctional family. My parents were alcoholics, and it was tough, to be around that. And I got out of the Catholic Church, although it took some time longer before I escaped, but that was the start of it. And I got out of Vietnam because, I would have been drafted and sent to Vietnam. But I just said, hey, I spent 4 months in a mental hospital. And he said, oh, okay, go down the hall and talk to the doctor down there. And I got a deferment and saved my life. And also, I met a girl for the first time because I was kind of told to stay away from girls in grade school. And then I went to an all boys high school and didn't have any way to meet girls. I met this wonderful, very smart, funny, lively, but very disturbed young woman in the mental hospital, and we fell in love. And she was what they just diagnosed as schizophrenic in those days. It was kind of a crude diagnosis. She would disassociate and had multiple personalities. For 2 weeks, she thought she was Barbara Streisand, and we were dating, and she would go around singing "People," and I had to call her Barbara, you know, and that was very strange. Things become funny in retrospect, as they say that. What is it? Uh, Comedy is tragedy plus time. When I was years later, I sold a script to Barbara Streisand that I had written about the quiz show scandals, and she was going to make her directing debut and star on this thing. And so they had me rewrite it to make the main female character more suitable to Streisand. So I watched all of Streisand's movies, but I felt that I could write her really well because I had dated her for 2 weeks. In a sense, I mean, it was real easy to write in her way of thinking and talking. I didn't tell them that because they would have thought I was totally out of my mind to say that. I mean, but hey, I always told my students, if you have a bad experience, make a movie out of it, write a script, write a book, make some money off of it, if you can. Um, but this was a profound experience, being in love with this girl, and then we broke up, and then she killed herself later. She was suicidal, and I wrote a book about that called The Broken Places, which came out in 2015. That was a really hard book to write. It took me 49 years to write it in different forms. I wrote it first. I started writing it as a memoir, but it was sort of facetious, and I didn't think it worked. And then I wrote it as a screenplay, which was a good screenplay. Everybody liked it, but nobody would make it because it was too disturbing. Although Francois Truffaut was a friend of mine, the great French director, and I offered it to him, which is kind of short-sighted because my favorite autobiographical film is his great film, The 400 Blows, about a troubled young kid. But he wouldn't let Claude Chabrol direct The 400 Blows, so why should I have Truffaut direct my story? I should have done it myself, but back then I couldn't say I want to direct this film. I mean, I tried for a while to say I want to write and direct this, but people would just sort of sneer. But he was having dinner with Spielberg and Amy Irving when they were married, and she was saying there aren't any good parts for women that I can find, And he said, "Well, I found one. You should play this. It's a great part for a woman, And told her about the script, and she called the next day. She called my agent and got the script and read it quickly. And she called back and said, "Don't do it without me." And she let us use her name to try to sell it. And unfortunately, she wasn't a big enough name to get the thing sold. Uh, the ending is very dark, where the girl kills herself, and some people said a couple producers said they would make the film if I put a happy ending on it, and I wouldn't do that. So I realized it should be a book, So I wrote it as a novel. I couldn't sell the novel, but I spent 2 years on the novel. And then I thought later, well, it really should be a memoir after all. It's my story. And so I wrote it as a first person memoir instead of a third person novel. And it all clicked. It became, it fell into place. So one of the things, this will kind of relate to your question about writing this new book, I Love Movies, but is Tennessee Williams, who I've always loved. I've read all his works in the 80s, and I think he's our greatest playwright, even though he's trashed by a lot of people. But he said a writer should never be embarrassed, and I took that seriously because it was difficult to tell some of these stories about having a breakdown. You know, is considered shameful by some people in our culture. Not as much as it used to be, but I didn't talk about it very much, and a lot of the experiences were painfully awkward experiences about sex and my parents drinking and everything. But I just figured if you're going to tell the truth, you better not be embarrassed by it. So I did that, and it really helped. But it was hard to do. So when I came to this new book, it wasn't that hard to do because I had the experience, I think, of writing that memoir and other kinds of memoir type things. My last book on Wells, Whatever Happened to Orson Welles, is partly a memoir of knowing him in the last 15 years of his life and working with him. I had the good fortune to be an actor in his film The Other Side of the Wind, which you can watch on Netflix. I spent 5 years acting in that film. And it's a memoir slash critical study. So I think as a writer gets older, you have a tendency to write autobiographical works more often. So this book was kind of fun to do.
Well, you've mentioned a lot of disillusionment or things that shocked you or disappointed you when you went to Hollywood. Do you feel there was something that you lost along the way that you wished you'd been able to retain?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I lost was my delusions about Hollywood. And it's good to lose your delusions. Um, I kind of see my life as, and this I think is true of a lot of people, that we live in a society that fosters a lot of lies and disillusionment. Um, on the Kennedy assassination, as you guys well know, we've been lied to systematically by the government and the mainstream media for 62 years. And what motivates me and other people and people who do podcasts on it is we want to know the truth. We want to excavate the truth from beneath all these lies. And so my whole life has been kind of a search for uncovering the truth. And I was raised in a false value system. The way I look at it now, the Catholic Church was not a viable way to live. I took it very seriously, and it was you know delusional in many ways. And then I feel my parents' life. When you're raised by alcoholics, it's a big lie because you know. It's a group called Adult Children of Alcoholics, and they talk a lot about how people live a myth. That they put up a good front for the public. My parents were both journalists in Milwaukee, and they had good reputations, but the public didn't really know what went on behind the scenes. And so my whole life has been kind of an attempt to look behind the curtain. There's a documentary. A former student of mine, Hart Perez, did a 1 hour video documentary on my career as a film historian, and I titled it "Behind the Curtain," Joseph McBride on writing film history, because I always want to look behind the official stories that we're fooled by. So my Frank Capra biography is, his myth was a complete fabrication almost. He and the media created this image of this kind of Gandhi-like lover of humanity who made these heartwarming films, and his life was anything but. And so I came along and discovered that, and it took me 7 years to get that story out. It was a big scoop. I felt as the journalist, I had a big scoop about Frank Capra that had never been printed. But it was hard to get out, and I spent 4 years in a legal battle with my original publisher, Random House, and my editor, famous Robert Gottlieb, who was Robert Caro's editor, um, and Frank Capra's archivist, Janine Basinger at Wesleyan University. They were trying to stop this book or neuter the book, take it over and edit the book without my approval. And I fought this ferocious legal battle. It was very difficult to do, but I won. I had to go to a different publisher, Simon and Schuster, but I got the book out, so I felt very happy about that. I even wrote a whole book about that struggle. It's called Frankly Unmasking Frank Capra, about how I discovered the truth. It's really, I love the process of doing research. That's the most fun when you're doing a book is, you travel around, you meet all these fascinating people, you talk to all kinds of people. Like in the Capra book, a lot of film biographies before that, they would only interview 10 or 12 people, and they were usually movie stars. And they wouldn't interview what are called ordinary people, regular folks. And Robert Caro's first volume on Johnson had come out, and that inspired me because if you read that book, like the first 40 pages or so, Johnson's not even in them. It's about the women of the hill country in Texas and what a tough life they had before electricity came to the hill country thanks to LBJ. He brought electricity, and the struggles they had on a daily basis are very vivid in Caro's book, and it's just great. And he's a relentless journalist. His book on Robert Moses is probably the greatest nonfiction book I've ever read. So I was inspired to go interview all the people in Capra's life who had never been interviewed, like his crew guys were terrific sources because the crew people really know how a filmmaker works. Capra lied a lot about his methodology, but I also interviewed all the people who grew up with him and lived in his neighborhood and went to school with him, grade school, high school, college, all those kind of people. And really fascinating stories they all had to tell. And so I revealed the hidden truth, and that became my kind of MO in life is, digging behind the official story. So when I came to write this book with Danny Perry, um, I was doing it to myself. I mean, I was kind of applying these methods to myself, and I had to keep telling myself, let it all hang out and tell the truth. It wasn't as hard as it would be if you wrote a autobiography of your private life. It might be harder, I think, to talk about all the gnarly things you got into in your relationships. I did think about that a lot when I wrote this book. It would bring up a lot of bad memories of things, but they weren't necessarily relevant to the story of my life as a writer. Some of the things I brought in, like in Blood and Guts, I realized belatedly that I was dealing with some issues in a very unpleasant series of relationships I was having at the time. I wasn't even conscious of that when I wrote this screenplay, but it became clear to me later. It was interesting. So that became part of the story. But it was more about how I wrote all these books. And I think, that's fascinating enough. And the book is over 700 pages long. So I guess I have to do another 700-page book about my personal life. But I think I've kind of done what I need to do on that by doing the broken places, because that was the most interesting and formative period of my life. That period of, adolescence, growing up changed my whole life and formed me as I am now.
Sorry about that. I was just listening to you. I grew up with alcoholic parents too, and so I kind of I know where you're coming from, and the anguish and the confusion when you're growing up, and how it really distorts the way that you enter into young adulthood, and it's very confusing. And I commend you for overcoming that, because it took me a good 40 years to overcome a lot of, my mother passed away from a fentanyl overdose, and my dad just died a year ago, and both are related to addiction. And I'm recovering myself from alcohol. And so the story itself really hits home to me. And I just want to thank you for sharing your story with that. I mean, this is really important for our listeners.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about your parents. I mean, it's similar. Both my parents died of incidents. Well, my mother actually died of an overdose, probably accidental pills and liquor. My dad died too young. I mean, he was 79, I think, but he could have lived longer if he hadn't abused his body with drinking and he wasn't eating enough. Alcoholic people sometimes are malnourished because they don't eat. That situation. So I mean, it sure is tough growing up because you want a stable family life to support you, but if you don't have that, it's a struggle, isn't it? But how did you finally? You say I'm also a recovering alcoholic, and I I I thought when I was a kid I'm not going to drink, and then I got into it in college, and I drank for until 1991 when I finally stopped. And my life has been a lot better since I stopped. I mean, my productivity, among other things. But how did you manage to get? You said it took you about 40 years. How did you manage to get out of all that?
I kept going off on just drinking tangents, because I like you, I swore I was never going to become an alcoholic. I swore I never was going to be anything in that regard. But then you go to college, you say I'm only going to drink sparingly, and then that just kind of starts leading into down the rabbit hole. And then you start developing the mentality that you can control it, and the only way that you can have fun is get drunk and socialize and all that type of stuff. And unfortunately, it just, I mean, it cost me relationships, friendships, and whatnot. I even got to a point where I almost lost everything. And then eventually my dad had died. And the night before he died, I was drunk texting him saying that, I was upset with him when I was a kid, and how could he did this and did that and did this. And his last words to me before he passed away were, I love you, son. And then he died the next morning. And I just was like, it was probably the most eye-opening thing. I mean, because I've quit before, and you go to AA meetings, and you're like, it doesn't feel genuine, doesn't feel real, any of that stuff. That's my experience. But when he died, I was just like, it was just, I mean, I lost my best friend. I mean, he was my best friend. We were drinking buddies and stuff, in my early 20s and late 20s, watch football games together and stuff. And it was a big reality check. And then I thought of my children, and then my health as well, like you mentioned about your dad's health. Um, and I just thought about all that, and I wanted to be here for them, and I wanted to live a long life and have productivity, and make the most of what I have left. And so, um, yeah, yeah, that's what happened. And it'll be on tomorrow. It will be, let's see, 14 months, or actually 16 months that I've been sober. So
Good for you. Good for you. Yeah. So when your dad died, did you stop? Were you able to stop cold turkey then? Or?
no, it was a week afterwards. My son, I had an episode where I felt like I was having a heart attack, and my son looked at me and he was panicking and all this other stuff. And then I was just like, okay, that's it. I'm done. I'm over it.
Mm.
Can't do it anymore. And, when for me, when that affects anything that of my children, I mean, I have to toss it out because like my children are my top priority, and I just can't, I can't hurt them, so.
Yeah, that is literally a sobering series of events you went through there. But I mean, it's great that you were able to do that, but also that you and your dad were best friends. I mean, you had some good times together and a good ending in a sense, where he told you he loved you right before the end. And I mean, there's some good things mixed in with the bad things, as always, I guess. But
Yeah. Well, and I do appreciate that. And I want to just again thank you for the story that I mean, because it's really personal and not a lot of people share their past, especially with their parents and stuff. And so I just want to let you know that it hit home with me. And yeah, I mean, it stories like this inspire people because when you are a drunk, and when you're somebody that doesn't feel like you can kick the habit or whatever addiction that you're in, you feel like you're in such a dark place. But if you listen to stories like yours, Joseph, or you know, maybe myself, I don't know, I don't want to be that, narcissistic, but I mean, like there's a lot of stories out there that can get people out of that situation, and it's inspiring, so I know we got off topic there, but I again, with you sharing that was just, it's really, I just want to thank you because I mean that's going to really help out a lot of people who do watch this,
well, thank
so.
you, and I'm glad. That's kind of what you hope when you write a book is that it'll have resonance. I'll mention another book. I have a brother named Pat who's a doctor, a wonderful guy, and he wrote a memoir too with his twin brother Dennis, who is now the mayor of our town, Wauwatosa. And Pat's book is called "The Luckiest Boy in the World," and what it is a memoir of his adolescence. He won a contest to become the bat boy for the Milwaukee Brewers, and I had tried to do that with the Milwaukee Braves. I didn't win the contest. I wrote an essay, but Pat wrote one that got him the job, and he was the visiting team bat boy for the Brewers. So he worked with all these amazing players, and I mean, like he said, the first day he was a bat boy, Ernie Banks was on the team that he was, the Cubs, and Ernie Banks said, "Hey, son," he said, "You want to play catch?" I said, "I sure." Ernie Banks said, "Let's play too." His famous line, and they went out and played catch, and wow, I mean, this is like amazing dream come true. And Pat is a very charming, fun guy, and all the players liked him a lot. And but it got him out of our house too. That was his struggle, and he writes about the. I mean, he in some ways it was worse when he was growing up. My parents were in worse shape, and he carved out a life for himself that had some meaning, but he wasn't sure what he was going to do, and he thought he'd become a veterinarian. And the players would say, "Pat, work with people, become a medical doctor," and they actually chipped in to help him go to medical school. It's kind of like a Frank Capra movie where the players put money in a thing to give him money, and so he wrote this wonderful, fun but moving memoir about growing up, having the responsibility of working with adult players. Some of them were idiots. You know, he mentions Lou Piniella. I said, like, who are the worst people you dealt with? He didn't really dish the dirt very much, but he couldn't help it with a few people. Lou Piniella, he said, would trash the dressing room when something went wrong. And, Pat's job, he became the assistant clubhouse manager. And these guys put out a lot of food for the players and, make everything nice and neat for them and arrange things for them. And Lou Piniella would come down in the locker room and smash all the food up and throw it, all over the place. And Pat said the second time Lou Piniella did that, he just sort of sat there and stared at him. And Lou Piniella kind of got the point after a while, like, what an asshole you are. Willie Mays was another one. Willie Mays was kind of a terrible person, a great, great player. But anyway, he writes about some of the guys who were just wonderful people too, including, like Ted Williams, one of the great hitters of all time. Had a kind of a bad reputation because he didn't get along with the press and the fans very well. because they gave him a hard time. But Pat said he was a wonderful man. He he took time to talk to him about hitting, and Pat was asking him for advice about hitting, and he was telling Pat, some tips, and then he said, how's your eyesight, son? And he said something like 2400 or whatever it is. There was a long pause, and Ted Williams said, "Have you thought of pitching?" Ted Williams had legendary eyesight. He allegedly could see the ball turning over. He could see the stitches turning over as it came toward him. I guess it was true. But anyway, it's full of those stories. So Pat wrote about his way out of the situation. He became a prominent cardiologist and made a very good life for himself, and he's thriving. And so did all my siblings. I have six, five brothers and one sister. They've all done really well, and so actually, I try to look at my parents, despite the pain and suffering we went through, they put a lot of effort into supporting us, which is kind of I took it all for granted. When you're a kid, you don't think about how do your parents put the food on the table, but just to feed us 7 kids, can you imagine the cost of groceries and all that? And, clothing and, and making sure that we all did well in school and didn't get in trouble with the cops and all that kind of stuff. They did a good job of that, so I kinda look at the good side of my parents. That's one thing you could do, kind of try to, pay tribute in your mind to the positive things they gave you. My mother got me into politics, for example. My brother, the mayor, credits her with his interest in politics. He was a lawyer for the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, for 30 years. It did a lot of good for working people, helping them. And then he became the mayor of this town. And he wrote a memoir recently, A City on the Edge, which is about being a mayor in the time of pandemic and unrest. At the time of the George Floyd murder, they had demonstrations in his town because a policeman had shot some black people and killed them. And so there were all these demonstrations that my brother had to deal with. And so I urged him to I said, keep a diary, write a book about your time as mayor. And he wrote a very good book that just came out a few months ago, A City on the Edge, and Dennis McBride. So 3 of us have written memoirs. That's pretty good. You know, we have a lot of stories to tell, I guess, but we've all, come out of it well, and that's kind of part of the point of this book that I wrote is that, I try to turn these bad experiences into good experiences, like the Hollywood period. That was the most painful part of the book to write because I went through some really miserable experiences there, dealing with sharks. I wasn't ready for the dishonesty and crookedness that I would encounter, but it taught me the realities of life big time and how to survive. I mean, I think that I managed to get the Capra book out despite all this tremendous legal trouble because I knew the ropes after living in Hollywood. It was Hollywood was worse in some ways than the publishing industry because at least in the publishing industry, you're supposed to have final say over what's printed. They can't change what you wrote. Like in the film, but in the film business, you write a screenplay and they can do whatever they want with it. Um, but the author has more rights, and so I knew how to defend myself, and I understood contracts, for example, because when I started as a book writer, I would just sign a contract, without reading it even. I mean, it was ridiculous. And then I learned how to negotiate my own contract. And one thing I did was the Beverly Hills Bar Association used to have a weekend seminar on contract law in the film and book worlds, and I covered that for Variety, and it was very instructive to me. And they gave out a booklet of contracts, like a film contract, a book contract, and I learned the hard way how to negotiate my own contracts and to be your own lawyer. I succeeded with the Capra book partly because I found a very good lawyer. I needed a good lawyer to help me. Maury Mealy, his man's name, he was a great lawyer. incorruptible. I had a corrupt agent, and then I ran into some corrupt lawyers, and the publisher kept trying to corrupt my representatives. But Maury was incorruptible, and so we prevailed. But it was tough. But I used the skills and knowledge that I had from the Hollywood experience to prevail in the book world. So that's what you have to do in life. These people sometimes say, people would say, isn't it glamorous to be a screenwriter? And I would have to kind of shake my head. It's really the opposite. It's a squalid life. Really, they treat writers really badly in the film world. And back in Wisconsin when I was starting, I had a kind of vague knowledge of what it'd be like to work in the film world. And I remember thinking these writers are always complaining, they're whining about everything. And I thought they were a bunch of spoiled people. But then you get to Hollywood and you find out, oh, it's even. I remember I interviewed Billy Wilder, who I wrote a book about later. He was one of my heroes, great filmmaker. He had started as a journalist, so I spent a lot of time in my book on him called Billy Wilder Dancing on the Edge, studying his career as a journalist in Vienna and Berlin. And it informed his work as a filmmaker because he makes exposés. His movies are kind of like I do, ripping the false facade off our lives and looking what's behind it. And so people would say he was cynical. And I once used that phrase talking to him, and he objected and he said, "But if I'm cynical, what adjective do you have for Peckinpah pictures?" Great comment. And I said, "Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to use that word because cynical is just another word for realistic, isn't it?" And he said, "Yeah, every play by Strindberg was cynical, every play by Ibsen was cynical. But he just believed in telling the truth. And now people look back at his films and they say, oh, yeah, and they don't use that word as much. It's kind of a thoughtless way to describe him. But early in my time, I met him. I was a newspaper reporter in Riverside, California, before I could get my job in Variety. But I would go to Hollywood and meet people. I was on the set of Billy Wilder's newspaper film, The Front Page, and I got to interview him for the first time. And I said, in Wisconsin, I thought that Sunset Boulevard was too harsh. But when I came out here, I realized it's like a documentary. And he said, it's a Valentine. I love it. It's a Valentine. you know, it's romance in a way. But he said, but every business, he said, has this kind of slush under it. He said, if you make a movie about the oil industry, it's Texaco versus Enron or whatever. There's a slush under it, or television industry network. He mentioned was hot film at the time, and that shows the ugly underbelly of television news. Um, so I learned the hard way, but that's life. And so I try to do that in my books. Tell people, here's the real hard truth about Capra or Spielberg or Wells. Even though these people are great filmmakers, that's one of the things I explore in my work, and I think our culture has a problem with this. That if you find out the human flaws of people think, well, I can't like their movies anymore. You see that with Woody Allen, for example. I don't think that he did what he was alleged to have done by Mia Farrow, the child molestation claims, but he people don't like it that he married Sun Yi, who was Mia Farrow's daughter. Um, but whatever. But I still think he's a great filmmaker. He may not be the most wonderful human being in the world, but the same thing with John Ford, for example. He was a very difficult guy to deal with on purpose because to survive in the film industry, you have to be kind of a bastard in a way. And but he was tough and mean, even to people he loved. John Wayne and Harry Carey Jr., those guys he worked with, he was gave them a hard time, but they realized he was a great artist. And but I had to kind of deal with that. I went through period where I kind of worshiped him. Then I found out the bad side of John Ford, and I had to try to reconcile them. And I realized you just have to accept both sides of people. He was both a great artist and a very difficult human being in some ways, but also he was capable of great generosity and kindness and love too. He was hard to rationalize. And one of my insights I had as a writer, Abraham Polanski was a friend of mine. He was a great blacklisted writer director. He did one of my favorite films, Tell Them Willie Boy is Here, which I think is a great Western about the way Native Americans are treated in our country, and very radical film. And he admired Ford a lot. And I once said in his presence that Ford was conservative, and he said, well, you can't just say he's conservative. He's much more complicated than that. He had his liberal side and his conservative side. I mean, his films are full of contradictions. And I began realizing that kind of opened the door for me to understand John Ford, which is to not try to, you know, reconcile these contradictions, but to admit them. I thought of him, Richard Nixon, to go back to Richard Nixon, who fascinates me. I wanted to meet him, and he always said that Ford was his favorite filmmaker. And so I wrote him a letter, and I said, can I come and interview you? And he wrote back and he said, John Ford is my hero in every sense of the word, but I'm too busy writing a book about world peace. So I will write you a response. I just don't have time for an interview. And 1 week later, I got this envelope from 7 World Trade Center, Richard Nixon's office. And he had written a 535-word essay on John Ford, which was fascinating. Personal essay on his relationship with Ford, who he got to know late in life. And it was kind of a Nixonian rant about Vietnam and how they kind of agreed on Vietnam and stuff. But he made a very good observation. He said that Ford was America's Tolstoy, and most people would say Ford is America's Shakespeare because he dealt with our history and the way that Shakespeare dealt with English history and the history plays. But Tolstoy was an artist of tremendous contradictions, maybe the greatest writer of all. But he was an aristocrat who wanted to be a peasant, and he was a libertine who wanted to be a saint, and he was just a mass of contradictions. He was an impossible guy to live with, and I read a biography of his wife. Boy, did she put up with a lot of grief. And you can't reconcile these contradictions, and Ford was like that too. And so I just kind of reported and accepted the contradictions and tried to make sense out of his life, but without squeezing him into a shape that was misshapen. That's what you have to do when you tell the truth about some artist. But I love Ford movies, even though I know that he was cruel to some of his collaborators. And Frank Capra, people are surprised. They say to me, "You wrote this scathing expose of Frank Capra, but what do you think of his movies?" I was always a big Capra fan. I like his movies even more now, oddly enough, because I understand them better. I understand where they're coming from. Um, because people used to think, even his fans sometimes would say, well, his films are kind of confusing because there'll be something very liberal, and then there'd be a scene that would be very conservative, and, a whole potpourri of things in one movie, contradictory things. Yeah, and the answer is that he was a very conservative right-wing guy who worked with very liberal screenwriters, including some communist screenwriters, like the man who wrote Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, one of my favorite movies, greatest American political movie, probably. Sidney Buckman was a member of the Communist Party when he wrote that film. And Capra knew that, and he could accept that. And one of my best sources was his personal secretary who was with him for 39 years. And he said, one of Capra's great strengths was he could work with all over the spectrum. He could work with one. Capra's secretary said he could work with people on the left and on the right and in between. And he got strength from that because he would kind of take the best ideas from people and reject other things. And he was that's why he was a great popular filmmaker, because he could respond to the needs of disparate people in the audience. All different kinds of people could find something in his films to like, whether you were liberal or conservative or whatever. Um, but so what I now understand where these things are coming from, and I can see flaws in his films when they contradict themselves, but they're really interesting films and very moving. And he's a great director of actors, for one thing. That's the one great talent that he had. I think he wasn't a great writer, even though he was frustrated. He wanted to be. And he was not a great visual stylist. I discovered it was more his cinematographer, Joe Walker, who brought the Capra visual style to the films. But he was a great director of actors. He really understood people quite well and was, we talked about interviewing. When you look at pictures of Capra on the set with his actors like Gene Arthur, Jimmy Stewart, there's a great rapport they have. They're looking at him with, great eye contact and smiles. And Capra had a wonderful warmth when he wanted to, and he could be very charming. And um, just he could understand the actors' needs and what to say to them and all that. And so those performances, one of the few things I couldn't figure out what to say in my Capra book was to analyze Jimmy Stewart's performance in Mr. Smith. It's one of the greatest performances I've ever seen, and I could never find the right words to do it, and so I had to kind of let it go. And then I found Orson Welles said Jimmy Stewart's performance in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is beyond praise, and I thought, okay, great, I'm vindicated. It's beyond praise. Just perfection. It's like a real person on the screen, and just an amazing performance. I tried in my book before the one I just wrote. I did a book on George Cukor, who was one of the greatest actors, directors. I decided to study his work by studying about 60 performances in his films and write about, rather than just write essays on the films in a conventional way, I would write about great performances in his work, Garbo and Camille, or Katharine Hepburn and Sylvia Scarlett, or Rex Harrison in My Fair Lady, or Claire Bloom in The Chapman Report. And I tried really hard to have a vocabulary to describe what an actor does and what makes a good film performance, because I think that's something most people don't really understand very well. You look at, this is award season, and the performances they give awards to usually are what I call the most acting, not the best acting, but people who wave their arms around and cry and scream, and that's how you win an Emmy award, especially. And some of the best actors never got Oscars for their acting. Cary Grant, for example. I mean, has there ever been a better movie actor? Jimmy Cagney. You know, um,
Can I make a mention of one movie real quick? And this is one of the things I wanted to pick your brain about real quick. Giant. I love Giant. Giant is one of my favorite movies of all time. James Dean playing Jet Rink. The windmill scene where he sees that the land is his, and he just. I think that's one of the. I mean, he doesn't say a word in that scene, but it is absolutely one of the most breathtaking scenes I've ever seen on film. The way that he just, I mean, the legend goes that George Stevens pissed him off prior to that take, and you can see him walking around kicking a can or kicking something, and as he's walking to get up to the windmill. And I love Giant. Giant to me is, I mean, like you like Mr. Smith's, or goes to Washington. Giant to me is, a lot of people, like my kids, won't sit through because they think it's too boring. But I like, as much as people hated Rock Hudson in it, I love how they address race in it. The film to me is a masterpiece. It is absolutely incredible. Um, James Dean, for only his third mainstream film before he passed away. Good Lord, what a movie!
and I love him as an old man too. I mean, some people say, well, he's great as the young hothead Jet Rink, but when he's an old man. But I thought he was a great old man. I mean, he was convincing and really tragic character, King Lear like figure when he has this kind of meltdown, at that big event where they're honoring him. It's so tragic. Yeah, that's a great movie about America, and a great movie about ethnic conflicts. Very ahead of its time in dealing with Latinos and Latinas in Texas and the whole conflict with Anglos. Back in 1956, people weren't really talking about these things, and he dealt with it in such a moving way. I love the ending in the movie where he shows the kids, where Rock Hudson, who is a bigot at the beginning, has to accept the fact that his son marries a Mexican American woman, and they have kids who are Latinos, and the two kids in the little playpen, one who's very white and one who's brown, and their big eyes. George Stevens, the director, has these huge close-ups of their eyes, and he's playing "The Eyes of Texas" or "Upon You," that great song. And I love Rock Hudson in that movie. I've become a big Rock Hudson fan. I've been watching more of his movies, and I think he's very underrated. And he was a very gentle actor. And I used to think he was too unassertive or something, but that's what's good about him. He's very,
Well, the dynamics between both characters, though, like I like how like Rock's character was such a jerk and like a rich guy in the beginning, right? But as you can see, like you mentioned wonderfully just a minute ago, like he has kind of a tender heart though at the same time, and it's quite evident when they're in the cafe at the end and he beats up the guy, the the waiter, and I love how Stevens just connects everything together because it's like he really you could tell that he really cared about the character Jet Rink, and it's like the story of somebody who grew up poor, right? And if they're poor, they have this humbleness about them. They're sweet. They're just a person that just cares about humanity. But when they get a bunch of money, that ruins them. And not to say that Jet Rink was ruined by that. I would say that he thought that he would be happy if he had all this money, but it turns out he was probably the most miserable person out of that whole story because he didn't have the one thing that he wanted, which was love. That's what he was looking for the whole time.
yeah, and Stevens had made A Place in the Sun, which is an archetypal American story of a poor young man struggling for you know riches and beautiful women. In both movies, Elizabeth Taylor is the one that he's after, and that's based on Dreiser's great novel, An American Tragedy. And Stevens identifies with those striving characters. There's something very American, the trying to rise above your class, as Jet Rink manages to do, but his character flaws bring him down. That's yeah, the scene where he's marching and marking his land is so moving, and it's all visual. And Stevens was started in the silent days, like other great directors, and he was a cameraman back for Laurel and Hardy. I got to know him, and it's just a marvelous performance. There's a movie, the American Film Institute made a movie about America on the screen, and I forget the title of it, but it was a compilation of scenes from films. And they use that as kind of the archetypal scene of the American dream, is to have your ranch or your property and strike it rich. And he's covered with oil. It's a wonderful image of this guy. It's very ambiguous because it's dirt and mess. He's a mess, but he's rich, and then he becomes this very arrogant, uh, complete bozo. Whereas Rock Hudson is learning to be a human being thanks to the influence of his liberal wife from the north. And it's just a great movie overall, and an epic. Underrated movie. I think George Stevens is the most underrated American filmmaker. I love his work, and I liked him very much as a man. I talk about I love movies, but that Danny Perry asked me at the end of the book, he says, "Do you think you might want to write a book about George Stevens because you keep talking about him?" And I said, "Well, maybe. I mean, I kind of wish I could write a biography of him because there isn't a good biography of him, but his papers are at the Academy Library in LA, and I'd have to move down there again for months. He had this huge collection of papers, and this is what I haven't been able to do because it's too expensive, and disruptive to do that kind of thing. And there is a good critical study by Neil Sinyard, but there's room for another critical study. But I got to know Stevens a little bit, interviewed him a couple times, and he was such a warm, fascinating man to talk to, and really would listen to people and loved studying people, and he's the only filmmaker who, when he said goodbye, called me my friend. He said, "Goodbye, my friend." And, I just felt that he was a friend. And it's interesting, he didn't get along with James Dean at all in that movie. And the film that I'm in, The Other Side of the Wind, the Wells film, it's partly based on Stevens's relationship with James Dean, because Wells liked Stevens a lot. Stevens was one of the directors who was good to him when he came to Hollywood, when a lot of people were shunning this wunderkind Orson Welles. George Stevens befriended him. And Wells told me, though, he said he wanted to watch Stevens direct, and so he went on the set of Vigil in the Night, a film that Stevens was directing, and Stevens was sitting in his chair like this, and he was known for, he would take these long timeouts to think about things, and everybody had to just wait till he stopped thinking. And Wells sat there, and he kept waiting for Stevens to do something. He realized he was asleep. And so he stood there for like half an hour, and Stevens was asleep all the time. He never got to watch him shoot. He thought that was very fun. But James Dean called Stevens fatso when they made that film, and he was just really hard to direct, and difficult guy, even though he was a great actor. And Stevens had such a hard time with him. And so Wells, in The Other Side of the Wind, John Huston plays a legendary old director he's discovered this young actor, and the guy is his protege, but he has a difficult, complex relationship with him. It's partly based on the James Dean character. And at the end of the movie, Houston has bought a Porsche to give to the young actor as a present. But the guy walks off the set because he's rebellious. And so Houston gets drunk and drives off in the Porsche and dies in a kind of a suicidal crash, kind of like James Dean's fatal crash in his Porsche, which was not actually, I mean, he was going 70 miles an hour and he was sideswiped by some guy. It wasn't actually really his fault. But they forbade him to drive his sports car, during the shooting, because they worried that something like that would happen to him. You know, he was a doomed character, and that that becomes part of The Other Side of the Wind that I'm in. I play a young film historian who's going around asking kind of silly film buff questions of John Huston all the way through the film, and Wells is kind of having a good time satirizing serious young film scholars. But he let me write my lines with him before every scene. he would say to me, "What would you say here?" And I would throw out questions, and then he would pick the ones he liked, and then he'd rewrite them and make them more pompous. But one that I brought up was, I realized the character is partly based on Hemingway, as he told me, and the film takes place on July 2nd, which I immediately realized is Hemingway killed himself. And so I said, why don't I ask this guy, as we're riding in the car, how his father's suicide impacted his film work or influenced his film work? And Wells loved that question and had me ask that in the opening part of the film. And the cover of the book, I Love Movies But, is a frame enlargement of me in the car, close up. Wells had two close ups of me in that scene, writing on my wrist, because when I met Peter Bogdanovich the first week I was in Hollywood, he saw that I had a lot of writing on my wrist, and he said, "What's that?" I said, "Oh, I was at Fellini's Satyricon today, and I ran out of paper, so I started taking notes on my wrist." I still do that, actually. It's just a quirk. And Peter thought this was hilarious, and he told Wells. Wells said, "I gotta have that guy in my movie because he writes on his wrist." So he told me, when I was in the movie, to keep filling my wrist with things like mother fixation and Oedipus complex, and so I had to, for 5 years, I had to keep writing on my wrist to match it. And when I saw the final version of the film, I couldn't believe they actually have two close-ups of me doing that in the film. I thought maybe one would make it into the film, but they have two. But I asked him that question about his father's suicide, and suicide became a bigger theme through the film. There's a long scene where the Houston character talks about his father's suicide with the character that Bogdanovich plays, who's his protege and kind of his Boswell, and he's asking him questions. And Houston is kind of having a meltdown, remembering his father killing himself and how traumatic that was. And for Hemingway, that was a trauma. And then, suicide tends to run in families too. That's one of the things that happens. Tragic situation. And Hemingway hated his mother. And one reason I had read that he hated his mother was that she sent him the pistol that his father used to kill himself for Christmas that year. Although then I read there's an interesting biography of him, the only one written by a woman. Um, and she discovered that Hemingway asked his mother for the pistol. So that puts kind of a different spin on that story. Makes the mother look less sinister when you find out that she didn't just send it gratuitously. But he thought his mother helped drive his father to suicide. It's very complex, very interesting subject.
Well, the title of the book is called I Love Movies, but just came out. You can pick it up at stickingplacebooks.com. It's been called Honest, Funny, Unsparing, and Deeply Humane. And the reviews are really good about the book. And we recommend that you pick it up again at stickingplacebooks.com. You can also pick it up at barnesandnoble.com and amazon.com. Recommend that you go into stickingplacebooks.com to get a discount. So, yeah, just what a wonderful conversation we've had thus far. I know Mr. Frame over here wants to cut in a little bit of your expertise about the JFK assassination, if that's okay.
Thanks, Joe. So, in your Into the Nightmare, you had evidence that Tippett and his partner Menzel were looking into Oswald as early as 1245, and I believe that you mentioned that Oswald was known to the DPD, the Special Services Bureau, I think, beforehand as a subversive. Um, did you? How did you find that out? Were there files on the surveillance or intelligence, or what? Tell us what that might have looked like, because that's the first I've ever heard of that.
Yeah, well, the reason, I mean, I studied the case from the moment it happened, and I really got into it in the '80s, early '80s. Over the years, I read a lot about it, and I began to think about Tippett because he was a mystery figure. Sylvia Mara wrote, I think, the best book on the Kennedy assassination. It's called Accessories After the Fact. She really demolishes the Warren Report in a very lucid, beautifully analyzed way. That book holds up really well, and but she said Tippett is unknown and unknowable because the Warren Commission really didn't investigate his murder, and the Dallas police didn't investigate the killing, which happened about 38 minutes after Kennedy was shot, and they blamed both killings on Oswald. Um, and the House Select Committee in the '70s did some digging into Tippett, but not much, so it was underreported. But I met the great uh, Penn Jones Jr., who was a Texas newspaper publisher, who was small town newspaper guy, Waxahachie, Texas, is where he lived. And it was the Midlothian Mirror was his weekly newspaper, and he got into studying the case and broke a lot of scoops. And real intrepid figure and inspiration to a lot of us. Um, And so I met him in '83 when I first went to Texas. And he gave me the advice he gave to a lot of people. He said, take one aspect of the case, one that hasn't been studied enough, and research the hell out of it, which is great advice. And it goes along with my lifelong focus on, okay, here's this some story that hasn't been told, and why not? How come we don't know about this man? I mean, with Capra, I found there's tremendous wealth of information on all of us. This is long before the surveillance culture we live in, but there's a great paper trail on all of us. So Tippett is not unknowable. It's just people hadn't done the effort to know him. But from the beginning, there's one of the earliest books on the assassination, "Who Killed Kennedy" by Thomas Buchanan. Um, he speculated that Tippett was searching for Oswald when he got killed, and that this was, something conspiratorial about this. And so people were speculating that this had something to do with some kind of guilty knowledge of Oswald, but it turns out that they knew who he was. The official story is that the police didn't know who Oswald was until 2:10 p.m. when they got him to the police station downtown. He was arrested at 1:52 at the Texas Theater, and Kennedy was killed at 12:30. So they took Oswald downtown, and he had two different IDs on him. One was Alec Heidel, a pseudonym of his, and the other was Lee Harvey Oswald. But anyway, what I found out was they knew who he was ahead of time because they had, as you mentioned, the it was basically the Red Squad that a lot of police departments had in those days to keep track of subversive characters. And Oswald, had been a defector who had gone to Russia, and he was allegedly a communist. And all this was, as we've discovered, he was a false defector sent there by the CIA. And the Russians, the Soviets were not stupid, and they saw through his ruse, and then he came back to America. But he was uh, seen as a troublemaker by the Dallas police, so they had him under surveillance. They knew where he lived, and Jack Revel was the head of that unit, a very suspicious Dallas policeman. And uh, anyway, but Tippett and another policeman who I later discovered was William Menzel. Menzel was the officer who was assigned to that district. Tippett was out of his district at that time, which is something else that people wondered, why was he out of his district. So at 12:45, by 12:45, both of these cops were driving around Oak Cliff, a suburb of Dallas, just over the river, across the bridge from downtown, where Oswald lived, and they were hunting for Oswald. And I interviewed Tippett's father, and this is the kind of journalism thing that I would do. I tried to interview people who had never been interviewed before. And I realized that Tippett's father was 90 years old, and he was living in a very small town in the eastern Texas. And Edgar Lee Tippett was his name. He was a farmer still at the age of 90, and he was still sharp. He was a sharp old guy. And so I called him, and he said, "Come on out." And he said he had never been interviewed before. And I said, "Well, you were interviewed by the FBI, right?" And he said, "Oh, well, how did you know about that?" And I had the 19-page report. The only thing, the Warren Commission, at a certain point in early '64, a woman who was a junior counsel named Alfreda Scobie wrote a memo to J. Lee Rankin, the director of the Warren Commission, and said, "How come nobody's doing any research on J.D. Tippett? Isn't that important?" I mean, great question, right? And so he called the FBI and said, or he wrote a memo and said, do an investigation of Tippett. So within a week, they had interviewed a bunch of people, and they came up with the kind of basic facts about his employment and life, and they interviewed Edgar Lee Tippett, and there wasn't much to it. It was Mr. Tippett had worked in a defense plant in World War II, but he'd spent his life as a farmer and, et cetera. But I went there and interviewed him, and he told me that soon after the assassination, um, a policeman went to visit Marie Tippett, who was the officer's widow, to tell her what happened, what really happened to her husband. And he said that I later, Mr. Tippett didn't know the name of this other policeman, but I figured out it was William Menzel from what he, the circumstances he told me about. There are a lot of documents that support all this, um, but this was news. Menzel had told Mrs. Tippett that he said JD and I were told to go look for Oswald by name, and that he was headed to Oak Cliff. They knew where he was going to go, and they were supposed to hunt him down. And it wasn't clear from this policeman whether they were supposed to arrest Oswald or kill him. And I suspect that the orders were to kill him because I think that's what they had in mind. I think he was going to be killed on the street, or failing that at the theater. A lot of policemen swarmed to the theater where he went, and uh, he survived the theater by having the presence of mind to say, "I'm not resisting arrest. I'm not resisting arrest." And there were about 10 or 20 civilians there, and so they didn't kill him in the theater, but they killed him 2 days later, in the police station, to get rid of him. But Menzel told Marie that he said, I got into a car accident and I didn't make it to the scene, but JD made it there and he got killed, and I feel terrible because it could have been me getting killed, and I wish it hadn't been JD. And so that fascinating piece of information clarifies what Tippett was up to in the last minutes of his life. And it jived with some reports that I had been collecting that aren't in the Warren report, but people had known about them. Other researchers had turned up that he went to a record store, Top 10 Records on Jefferson near the theater, about 1 o'clock, and he hurried into the record store, which still exists, and there was a telephone on the counter, and he used the telephone, and people were there who reported this, and he made a call and listened and didn't say anything, so it's unclear whether he reached anybody or not, and put down the phone, and then he dashed off, and they said he drove very fast up side street and then turned onto 10th Street. That was the street where he was soon killed about 6 to 8 minutes later. And the Warren report lies that he was shot about 1:15, but it was really, according to witnesses, between 1:06 and 1:08, 1:09 at the latest. There are several witnesses who will who attested to that, but that was essential to the Warren claim that Oswald had shot him, because Oswald had been seen at his rooming house, which was about 9/10 of a mile away. He had been seen there about 1 o'clock by the housekeeper, Erlene Roberts. He came in and went into his room and changed his clothing a little bit, and allegedly picked up a gun, although I don't believe that actually happened. But she said that he then went out and she looked out the window and saw him standing on the corner as if waiting for somebody to pick him up. And that would have been about 1:03 or 1:04. And there's no way that he could have gotten to the scene of the Tippett killing by 1:06 or 1:08 unless somebody drove him there. And it's never been found that anybody drove him there. But the Warren Commission had to make it work, so they claimed that it was 1:15. And you can see the documents have been changed. Like there's a document from the hospital where Tippett was taken that said he was DOA at 1:15, and they actually typed over the second one to make it two, to make it 1:25. They didn't. It was a crude forgery. Um, so I really doubt that Oswald was there. There's no evidence. Also, the alleged gun that they took off him, um, it couldn't be matched to the bullets that killed Tippett. There was an honest FBI expert who testified that the bullets recovered and the cartridges couldn't be matched to the pistol that they presented into evidence. And John Armstrong has done great research on Oswald, and his book Harvey and Lee has chapters on the rifle and the pistol, and he proves through very dogged research that there's no way you could prove that Oswald owned either the rifle or the pistol that they entered into evidence. And a lot of people don't know that, but I mean, if you look at his book, it's really clear. But so anyway, Mr. Tippett helped. What I found was there was a car accident very close to the scene of the Tippett murder, in that time frame, and Menzel was the policeman, according to the police radio, who was sent to that incident. And he cleared the incident very quickly in a matter of just a few minutes. And it seems kind of strange if you go to, even a fender bender, it would take a while to write it up and interview the people, etc. But there was some kind of an accident, or maybe it was a fraudulent report, just to explain, give Menzel an alibi. He didn't, but he wasn't at the scene of the shooting. But J.D. Tippett wound up being shot, and I believe that he was ambushed um, by his own department, by corrupt people in the department, set up this ambush for him to. He drove into it, and somebody shot him. There was a police car in the alley. He pulled up his car right at a driveway in between a bunch of houses that went through to an alleyway, and there was a police car spotted in that alley, and there were two men in the car. Um, John Armstrong has been doing additional research on Tippett, which is what I hoped what my book would do, is inspire other people to really investigate this case further. And he's been doing great research, as has a guy named Gavin McMahon in Australia. They've been doing excellent research. And Armstrong thinks the two policemen involved were William Westbrook, who was the head of personnel, and Kenneth Croy, who was a reserve officer. And he thinks that Croy actually killed Tippett. He was the first officer on the scene. And one of the interesting oddities of the case, there were two young women in the corner house right where it happened, and they came right up when they heard the shooting. And one of them said the police were already there. Policeman was already there. And officially, it took a few minutes for policemen to arrive on the scene after, a civilian picked up the radio and said there's been a shooting. But there was a policeman already there, and so that could have been Kenneth Croy. And there's a photograph of him at the scene, etc. And I didn't identify them as among my suspects. In my book Into the Nightmare, I have a rundown of various people who were persons of interest, who might have been involved in the Tippett killing. There's a fellow named Daryl Garner, who I think is a person of great interest, who was a petty criminal who worked for Jack Ruby, who might have been involved in killing Tippett. One of the things that is odd about the Tippett murder scene, Jerry Rose discovered this in 1995. He had a assassination newsletter. He found out that quite a number of the witnesses at the scene were connected with Jack Ruby. And he speculated that Jack Ruby had staged the Tippett killing with the Dallas police. He was very tight with the Dallas police. And a number of the so-called witnesses were staged. And Gavin McMahon has found more evidence of that. He found out that the cab driver who was sitting in his cab at the corner had been told by a Ruby associate to be there. Helen Markham, the star witness for the Warren Commission, who was very confused but claimed Oswald was the shooter, they relied on her. She was told to be there by Ruby, and various other people were connected to Ruby, and he's all over that scene. And uh, a couple of the most important interviews I had were with Jim Lavelle, who was the detective supervising the Tippett case. He was the big guy in the white suit and hat who's handcuffed to Oswald when he was shot, but people will remember. and I interviewed Henry Wade, the former DA of Dallas, too. And what they basically indicated to me was they didn't really have a case on Oswald for shooting Kennedy. And Lavelle admitted this. He said, Captain Fritz, Will Fritz, the head of homicide, said, why don't we need to wrap him up on this Tippit shooting because I don't think, we really have enough to wrap him up on the Kennedy shooting. But what do you have on the Tippit shooting? And Lavelle said, well, I've got 3 or 4 witnesses, who can identify him. And the witnesses I mean, I spent years trying to figure out the witnesses because there were 10 or 20 people who saw parts of this incident. And they're all over the map. It's like the Japanese movie Rashomon, the classic, where people have different views of the crime. Some people said Oswald did it. Other people said 2 guys did it. And some people said a heavyset guy shot him. And then some people who identified Oswald only did it, months or years later and under strange circumstances. Um, Yeah, like, Reynolds, was shot in the head. He denied that he could identify the, shooter who he saw running. He saw a guy running away, and then he told the FBI when they came back to him, "I can't identify him," and the next day he was shot in the head by an intruder in his, auto, thing and miraculously survived a shot in the head, and then he said, "Oh, yeah, it was Oswald." He saw the light very quickly. So, I mean, the witnesses are all over the place, but, basically what I found out was they thought, "Well, let's get him on the Tippit case because we can cook up a case," and that helped explain something I found, a FBI memo back in the day before the internet. I used to go to the National Archives and go through the paper files and Xerox them, and I Xeroxed everything I could about the Tippit case, and one of the memos I found was one shortly after the assassination. It said Oswald was only arraigned for the murder of Tippit, not for the murder of Kennedy. We didn't arraign him on the murder of Kennedy. He was charged in both cases, but he was only arraigned for the murder of Tippit, which is odd. And when he did his midnight press conference that people can see on YouTube. Um, he seemed surprised when the reporters said, "You've been charged with shooting the president." He seemed surprised. They thought he was lying. And he says, "Well, I haven't been charged with that, but I'm told I murdered a policeman." He said, "I need legal assistance." And Lavelle told me Oswald was telling the truth. He said we had only told him that we're getting you charged with murdering the policeman. And he was shocked to find out he was also charged for killing Kennedy. And it turned out they did file the charge right around that time, but he didn't know about it at the time. So, I mean, a lot of these things, it all comes together. It's a big mosaic when you study the case. You combine eyewitnesses, you sort out conflicting stories, you match them up with documents and police radio, et cetera, et cetera. But I think I advanced the case by finding out what Tippit was doing. Oh, I should mention that in addition to going into that record store, Tippit pulled over a driver on 10th Street, uh, probably right shortly after that. A guy named Andrews was driving down the street, and Tippit pulled his squad car in front of him and blocked him and jumped out and looked in the back seat of the car, and there was nobody in the back seat of the guy's car. And Andrews said he could see the name Tippit on the officer's chest. And he didn't say anything, and then he took off and went off down 10th Street. So there's evidence that he was looking for Oswald. He also was seen at a gas station at about 12:45 there's a viaduct that connects Oak Cliff with downtown Dallas. When you're at the end of the viaduct, you can see the downtown, and you can get from downtown to Oak Cliff in about 5 minutes. And Tippit was sitting there at this gas station waiting for Oswald to show up on the bus, apparently. And a bus came by, and he wasn't in it because he had abandoned the bus. And so Tippett took off at a high rate of speed. And there were 5 people who saw him doing this. You won't read this stuff in the Warren Report, you know. So over the years, the combined efforts of me and other researchers have tried to figure out what Tippett was up to, and I think we've advanced the case that he was. So if he and Menzel were told to hunt down Oswald at 12:45, that means they were part of this plot with other members of the Dallas Police Department because officially they didn't know who Oswald was until he was arrested at the theater more than an hour later.
Right. So, sorry, Tim, just to follow up on that, just real quick. Um, would that do you surmise that it was Jack Revel who would have sent them if he's the head of the Red Squad, as you called it? We need to go check this guy out, go find him. He lives in Oak Cliff. Was that their superior, or was the Red Squad more of an informal? Uh,
92, 93, and I called Jack Revel, and he was very cordial, but he said, I don't want to talk to you because it's too painful. I don't talk about that anymore. Sorry, good luck with your book, he said. I was kind of surprised. And I was frustrated. And one other researcher had written about Revel that he was like the number one suspicious cop that everybody would like to talk to who probably knew a lot. He would have known, and Westbrook, being head of personnel, would have known everything about everybody on the force too. And I believe that Armstrong has demonstrated that Westbrook was heavily involved in whatever happened to Tippett. And why was he killed? We can get into that. But Revel had to have been supplying information on Oswald. And one thing that Henry Wade told me, which was a revelation, was he said that, well, I surmised, and I'm not the first one to do this, that Oswald was an FBI informant who was he had infiltrated the plot against Kennedy, and he was reporting to the FBI without realizing he was the patsy until the shooting occurred. And then he started realizing, I'm the patsy, and he said that on national TV that night. But Wade said that Oswald had talked to the FBI the day before the assassination. And I said, the day before? Really? And he said, well, a day or two before. And it turned out that James Hosty, the FBI agent who was assigned to Oswald and his wife, Marina, and Hosty claims in his book that Marina was his number one subject of interest because they thought she was a KGB sleeper agent, But he told, according to Wade, he told Jack Revel, we know this guy. We talked to him yesterday, and we thought he was capable of this, And Hosty denied these things, later. But that here's Oswald talking to the FBI a day or two before. Nobody knew this, really. And also, I found in the Dallas Morning News on November 24th, the day Oswald was killed, the paper came out before he was killed. It came, the Sunday paper comes out like at 5:30 in the morning, whatever it is, and it said that Oswald had spoken to the FBI on November 16th, and it's also known that he spoke to the FBI around November 12th because there's this story. Hosty admitted this in a congressional hearing that Oswald had come into the FBI office and he claimed that Oswald had left a threatening note. And this note was destroyed on the 24th after Oswald was killed. Gordon Shanklin, the head of the FBI office in Dallas, told Hosty to get rid of the note. And he flushed it down the toilet in the office. So Oswald had reported to the FBI 3 times that month at least, So that all fits in with this portrait of him as a loyal American who had infiltrated the plot against Kennedy and found out that he was going to be blamed for this.
He's Joe McBride, author of Into the Nightmare: My Search for the Killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit, along with Political Truth, the Media, and the Assassination of President Kennedy. You brought up a really good point just a moment ago, rather, about the hunt for Oswald. Now, uh, I'm only speculating when I say this, but when let me well, not say let me ask you a question. So, what if they were able to eliminate Oswald? Okay, somewhere during that period of time, let's say Tippett was successful in eliminating Oswald. Do you think that they would have framed another live Patsy at that particular time? Because the only reason why I asked this question, there are alleged, there's allegations of Captain Fritz having pre-typed confessions to people, let's say like a Buell Wesley Frazier, and that is speculation. I just want to make that clear. But do you think, in order to make sense of this whole assassination, do you think it was a possibility that they could have initially made it a two gunman type thing? That way, through history, we wouldn't have so many questions.
Well, that's an interesting notion, although I don't think the facts support that. I think what they planned would have been that Kennedy and Oswald would both be killed within an hour. I mean, then they would have said we're geniuses. I mean, there are even people now who say, "Look at what a great job the Dallas police did. They caught the killer of the president, with an hour and 22 minutes of Kennedy's shooting. It's pretty good police work." Um, but uh, you know, uh, this the Warren Report. One thing I go into the Nightmare. Um, if you look at the Warren Report, they have the so-called proofs that Oswald was guilty. There are only 8 of them. The whole case boils down to 8 so-called proofs, and they collapse when you study them. I have a whole section where I go through these one by one. They're all phony claims. And so I think what they would have planned would be Kennedy is killed, and then Oswald is killed, and we've solved the case and wrap it up, and we're geniuses. And that's, I think, what was going on there in Oak Cliff. They're trying to gun down Oswald, but he was clever enough to survive. Dwight MacDonald, the literary critic and film critic of Esquire, wrote a long, interesting review of the Warren Report, and he referred to Oswald's miraculous survival for 2 days in the custody of the Dallas Police Department. Kind of amazing that he survived for 2 whole days, because a live Oswald was threatening to the whole plot because they didn't want him telling what he knew. And, they claim they didn't record the interrogations. And there are rumors even that they took notes or even had tape recordings, but those very few notes have come out, of those interrogations. So we don't really know what he was saying for 11 or 12 hours when he was being interrogated. But they sure didn't want him to have legal representation, as he said, and he was begging for a lawyer. A live Oswald would have destroyed the whole case. So I think they wanted him dead, and then they hoped that they could just sort of convince people that they solved the whole case, and they could pin it on this one guy. And, circumstantially, he was in the building, and they planted the rifle and planted the cartridges, et cetera, et cetera. They still would have had to deal with all the other indications that there were 1 or 2 other shooters, at least in Dealey Plaza, if not 3. Um, uh, Vincent Salandria, who's a really good early critic of the case, he had an interesting theory. He called it a false mystery. He said it was designed to be transparent. He said the whole thing was so obvious if people could just see without preconceptions that this was a crossfire. Kennedy drove into an ambush, and he was shot from several directions, it couldn't be one guy. It's impossible for one guy to do all that. And but the media were co-opted and lied to the public. If we had had honest media people, the mainstream media, I mean, this is why I wrote Political Truth, which I think is one of my most important books. I've been a media critic my whole life, and since I've been a journalist my whole life, when I was at San Francisco State, they did a little video profile of me, and the woman Sylvia Turchin who did it said, "How would you define yourself?" And I said, "I'm an investigative reporter." And I've always thought of myself that way, and I think that's what I am when I write books about films and about the Kennedy case. And so there are people like me and many other diligent people who've been studying this case, and the heroes of the case, as I say in my book Into the Nightmare, are the witnesses, the ordinary people who've come out and told the truth, sometimes getting killed or threatened. Heroic people, and also the researchers and the journalists who've really, you know, dug into it. Penn Jones and Vincent Slandria, Mark Lane, people like that, Sylvia Marr. Those are the heroes of the case. There's a good book called Praise from a Future Generation by John Kellen, which is about the early researchers of the case. They were just a few people on their own writing for little publications and trying to get the truth out. Now it's, there's more of a community of people who care about it. I did find, by the way, there was a terrible documentary again on ABC the other day. They keep doing these phony documentaries. This was as bad as those ones that Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather used to do. But they mentioned that 65% of the public doesn't believe the Warren Report, and it's always been the case that about two-thirds of the public has not believed the bullshit, and that's a sign that the American public is smarter than the people who make these shows, and I think a lot of the lying reporters know the truth, but they're afraid to tell the truth because it's, as one of them told me, professional suicide if you dissent from the official story. But it's the alternate media who we have to rely on. Guys like you and people, forums and podcasts and blogs and books. There's more freedom in America to tell the truth in books, than there is in, major newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times lie to us on these subjects. And films, documentary films, and a film like Oliver Stone's JFK, you can get the truth out through the alternate media, and that's what we have to rely on, which is inspiring in that sense. But the point I was going to make was when I was teaching at San Francisco State, I found that our students today are woefully ignorant of history by and large because our K through 12 system does not really teach history properly. There was a disturbing survey a few years ago. It said American high school students, the majority think that we were fighting Russia in World War II and the Germans were our allies. I mean, that's how bad it is. I mean, wow. And I found teaching students, they really were blank slates on Vietnam and, Watergate. And I tried to teach them these subjects as a kind of covert history teacher by showing films on these subjects and then talking about. But the thing that was really gratifying was I would always do a lecture on the Kennedy case for a class I had called Film and Society, and I would show parts of the Mark Lane, Emile D'Antonio documentary Rush to Judgment, where they have some really important witnesses telling the truth. And then I would show the Zapruder film of the shooting, and I would talk about how that's been altered by the CIA, which most people don't realize, but it's proven. And I would then show there's a sequence in JFK where Kevin Costner as Jim Garrison says, "Let's speculate what really happened," and he talks for about 22 minutes, and Oliver Stone gives you his alternate view of what happened, which is quite close to what really happened. And then we would have really good discussions. And I'll say this for the students, they're all really interested and open-minded about this, unlike people my age. I'm a baby boomer, and people from my generation who lived through that are very nervous about this subject. They don't want to deal with it by and large, you know. Um, there's a very good book by Martin Schatz, who's a psychiatrist who studied the case, and he answered a question that bothered me. Why is it that, if two-thirds of the American public don't believe the lies about this, why don't they do anything about it? The president was killed by our government, and our government didn't want to solve the case. This changed my view of our country. And he said that there's a gap between what we know and uh, what we think we know and what we really know. And the media have done a great job in confusing people and making people think we can never really know the whole story. That's one of the things you hear on some of these shows is, well, we'll never really know. But in fact, we know a lot about what happened to Kennedy. We don't know the identities of the shooters and other key things, but we know if you really look at it honestly that he was killed in a crossfire and Oswald didn't do it and he was the patsy and the military were involved and the Dallas police were involved and the CIA was involved and the Secret Service was involved, etc. But the public, is kept thinking, well, we don't really know. And he said the problem is if you really face these terrible facts, you should do something about it. And most people aren't ready to do something about it. That's his analysis of the public. They're not willing to take the risk and be ridiculed. And, you get people making fun of you and calling you a nut. And the phrase conspiracy theorist is always thrown around as if that's always bad. I mean, conspiracies happen. I mean, everybody knows, say, that Watergate was a conspiracy, right? Um, but so there are conspiracies. Much of history is a conspiracy because conspiracy is just two or more people acting together, usually to do something illegal and, quietly behind, without doing it overtly. But there are a lot of fake conspiracy theories out there too. They've made it. The CIA came up with a memo in 1967 that anybody who is a conspiracy theorist must be insane, and they brainwash people. But you have to get over that, like I've done and you guys have done. It was hard. Like just I mentioned, it's embarrassing to write about your personal life, honestly, but you have to do it if you're a writer. And also, back in the day, I would try to talk about the Kennedy assassination to people and my friends, and they wouldn't want to hear about it. And that still happens, but you just have to sort of just go your own way and just keep studying the case, and I'll keep studying it until I drop dead. Yeah, hopefully this will be a long time in the future.
Exactly. Well, I want to be cognizant of your time. This has been fantastic. You did refer to something a few minutes ago, so I wanted to just touch on that briefly. If, so we have Tippett witnesses who have connections to Ruby, Markham, etc. And we also have Croy/Westbrook there at the scene. Whether one or both of those is true, to what end, if it's not Oswald, which I don't think any of us believe it is, to what end, why is Tippett killed, right? If he's not hunting Oswald, why would it be, if Ruby was doing this ahead of time, then, obviously that was the plan all along. Perhaps it was he didn't find him in time. He's got guilty knowledge. He needs to be eliminated. So, what are your thoughts on that? If it's not Oswald defending himself, why is it?
It's a key question. There's not a simple answer. I mean, one obvious thing that happened was it changed the focus of police attention from Dealey Plaza to Oak Cliff. You had dozens of police cars swarming into Oak Cliff, draining the downtown of police who should have been investigating the crime, the murder of the president, and shifting the focus. And as I mentioned, cynically, Wade and Fritz thought, well, we can pin the murder of the policeman on Oswald, and then everybody will think he killed Kennedy. I mean, that's a non sequitur. I mean, it doesn't make sense that if somebody killed a policeman, that he must have killed Kennedy. But you actually heard this said on that TV special the other day. It was verbalized that way. This is the logic that they sold to the public. Well, if he's a cop killer, 39 minutes later, well, he must have killed the president. Well, it doesn't quite make sense. Maybe some other explanation happened. But why was Tippit sacrificed? I mean, why was he a target? Part of it was possibly, I mean, just to be a sacrificial person to bring everybody into Oak Cliff so they could converge on the theater and get Oswald. I mean, there are credible sources that say that Oswald was in the theater as early as about 105, and he was not, as the official story has it, somebody who was at the Tippit scene at 1:15 and then made his way to the theater. He was sitting in the theater all that time. But another reason could well be that Tippit was part of the plot in some way, shape, or form. And that is, it enters into the realm of speculation. And, Tippit, for example, there is some debate about whether Tippit could have been one of the gunmen on the grassy knoll. And there is photographic evidence, that one of the shooters was wearing a Dallas police uniform. And he had a hairline that looked like J.D. Tippit's unusual hairline. So it's a possibility that Tippit was a shooter in the case, and but it's not provable. And but that's one of the reasons to eliminate somebody. And Tippit was, one thing I investigated was what were his political beliefs, and was he a racist? Was he right wing fanatic? He didn't show evidence of either of those vices, but he was working as a security guard in a diner in Oak Cliff, which was frequented by a lot of right wingers, including Bill Alexander, who was a fanatical assistant DA, and the owner, Austin's Barbecue was the place. Austin Cook, who I interviewed, was had connections to Jack Ruby through Ruby's financial backer was a sinister fellow named Ralph Paul, and Austin had been in business with Ralph Paul. So Tippit was working as a security guard in uniform in this diner for 3 years, and a lot of the right wingers would hang out in this place, as well as a lot of policemen. So they got to know Tippit, and they probably figured he's a malleable kind of guy we can get involved in whatever we need him to do. And he was a mediocre cop who had never been promoted. Um, he had PTSD, serious PTSD from World War II. And he was also financially kind of overextended. Oddly enough, he owned two homes. He only made something like $438 a month. But he and his wife owned two homes, and so he had a mortgage, and so he had to work, side jobs. But he came into some money in the summer of '63, and so it could have been a financial thing instead of he wasn't some crazed ideologue like some of the Dallas police were Ku Klux Klan members, and he wasn't. I couldn't find evidence of that, but he could have been recruited for financial reasons, And there are other rumors about Tippit possibly being involved in criminal activity, etc. So he was a guy who was known to the far right people who were involved in plotting the case with Ruby and the Dallas police, etc. And so he may have been involved in one form or another in the plot. I mean, he was. We know now that he was involved in trying to eliminate Oswald, and that could be a convenient reason to sacrifice him. But by sacrificing Tippit, they stigmatized Oswald as a cop killer. And I noticed on the police radio that when Kennedy is shot, everybody is kind of blasé almost. It's very kind of weird. And then when they say a policeman was shot out here, everybody gets really frantic on the police radio, and the pace increases, and the voices start raising. And so I asked Jim Lavelle, the detective. I said, "How did you guys feel when Tippit was shot as opposed to Kennedy?" And he had this evil little smile, and he said. Of the president's shooting, he said, "Well, it wasn't no different from a South Dallas N-word shooting." And he used the actual word, the N-word. Wasn't no different from a South Dallas N-word shooting. That's how they saw the Kennedy murder. That, like, who gives a damn? The president was killed. But when a policeman is killed, he said, yeah, of course, all of us get all excited. That's one thing, the standard thing in police departments. If a policeman is shot, that's everything is focused on that. That's a big deal. And it had been a while since a policeman was shot in Dallas. But it is disturbing too to think that they didn't really investigate this murder. And if they really cared about their brother policeman, why didn't they want to find the actual guy who killed him? Henry Waite said we really didn't work on the Tippit murder. And Lavelle told me he admitted basically by the end of the weekend we didn't do anything on it because we had Oswald. He thought we had it wrapped up. He claimed that over the following months they would get tips and he would investigate them. But there are people who say that actually, despite these claims, the Dallas police were prowling around the neighborhood and making sure they found the actual witnesses and then shutting them up, like Mrs. Markham. She was under police supervision for years to make sure that she told the story they wanted her to tell, and she was very, very anxious, And Mrs. Clemens, a black lady who came out of her house, she was a domestic working in a house right up the street, and when the shooting occurred, she saw two men involved, and she told the story to researchers. And she was very honest, and she was visited by a Dallas policeman who exhibited a gun and said, "You might get killed if you keep talking about this. Don't talk about this anymore." But she gave an interview to Mark Lane and Emile D'Antonio on film for Rush to Judgment, and she was never seen again after that interview in 1966. A lot of us looked for her, and we couldn't find evidence of what happened to this lady, but she was heroic. People like her told the truth, and they were warned not to. You know? So the Tippit case, Emile D'Antonio, the director of that film, who was an important radical documentarian, who I knew, he gave an interview in the 60s, and he said, when we were making Rush to Judgment in Dallas, he said all the anxiety was around the Tippit murder. He said when we went to Dealey Plaza, it was easy to film and nobody bothered us. But when we tried to investigate the Tippit murder and interview people on film in that area, everybody was extremely anxious. And Domingo Benavides, the guy who was the closest to the shooting, agreed to give an interview, and then the police told him not to talk, and he didn't show up for the interview the next day. He said all the anxiety was around the Tippit case. And so that kind of bore out the truth of what Penn Jones told me is some aspect of the case that hasn't been investigated properly and researched the hell out of it. And David Bellin, who is a junior counsel on the Warren Commission, one of the most vociferous liars and defenders of the Warren Report, said the Tippit case was the Rosetta Stone of the whole case. And by that he meant, since Oswald killed Tippit, he must have killed Kennedy, which is, as I said, a non sequitur. But I see it as the Rosetta Stone of the case for different reasons, because it opens up the whole different way of looking at what happened to Oswald and to Officer Tippit. And I'm glad that I opened that up. That was part of my mission writing this book, was let's get other people working on this case. And I'm glad to see a lot of researchers are focusing on that and digging into it because it's an aspect of the case that was neglected and is now being studied more and more. Well, thank you, Eli, and Tim. It's been wonderful talking to you guys. You guys are really sharp questioners. I appreciate it.
Well, yeah, we appreciate you as well. And again, thank you for being so influential to the JFK community with all the hard work you've been doing. Especially with Into the Nightmare, my search for killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit, as well as, and I just posted this up on my X page, Political Truth, the media and the assassination of President Kennedy. And we're going to definitely get that book trending out there for you. Your body of work is amazing. Again, we talked earlier about Capra. He has a book on Frank Capra that's the catastrophe of success. Am I correct? Did I mention that? Yeah, catastrophe. Forgive me. Searching for John Ford is also another one of his. Hawks on Hawks is another, and then he, like he mentioned earlier, The Broken Place is a memoir, and his body work is just absolutely amazing. Um, Joe, I just want to say on behalf of Eli and myself, this has been incredible. Thank you for taking a couple hours of your time to join us. And do you have any last words to our audience before you take off?
Well, I hope that people dig into the Kennedy case and read a lot. There are a lot of good books about it that various people have written, and think for yourself. As I told my students, don't just automatically believe in the mainstream media because there's so much lying to you out there. But I guess the lesson I try to give in my book, it's partly a cautionary tale. I love movies, but I talk about mistakes I made, stupid things that I did, and I should have known better, and I was misled and delusional about certain things, but I learned the hard way. But that's what you find out when you study a writer's life. It's a way of kind of showing you how to do your own investigation of the truth. I mean, I always told my students, every citizen has to be a critic of the media and don't just read. I mean, it's great to read a newspaper, but don't just read one. Read several and look at different sources and gather your own information and read it critically and make up your own mind about things and don't believe anybody who tells you something and look, do your own research, which is what I've been doing my whole life. And that's the fun part of it, and that's citizens' responsibility, and that's what keeps me going and keeps me excited. I keep wanting to learn more about what happened to Kennedy, and when I study filmmakers, I want to know. I'm curious to know. How did George Stevens make Giant, for example? I mean, I'll just tell you one story. Tim, you will love this story. George Stevens Jr. told me this. I worked with him on American Film Institute Life Achievement Award shows. He said when his father made Giant, there's a scene in there where they criticize the oil depletion allowance, which was this very corrupt thing that allowed oil companies to write off 27.5% of their profits, as a tax break. And Stevens, as a liberal, was against this. Kennedy, one of the last things he did was say we need to eliminate the oil depletion allowance. And I'm sure that didn't go over well with the people in Dallas who were plotting to kill him. But George Jr. said that Jack Warner, the head of the studio, who never came to filmmakers' office, they always had to go to his office. He showed up at his dad's office and begged George Stevens to cut that bit out of the film where they want to eliminate the oil depletion allowance. He said, "It won't play in Texas, or the people in Texas are going to go crazy. Please, please." But Stevens said, "Final cut." And he was a real tough guy. You had to be a tough guy in those days. And he refused Jack Warner. And he said, "I'm sorry, I'm going to leave that in the film." And actually, the film did really well in Texas, even though it's very critical in some ways of the Texas oligarchy. They loved the film, because it showed them as they were, and people like. I mean, I did a piece when I was a journalist in Madison. I did what I thought was a really scathing report on an American Legion rally. And I thought, geez, I'm going to get in trouble for this. And I got a letter from the guy who was the head of the American Legion in Wisconsin saying, "What a wonderful article you wrote. Thank you so much. It was great to read all about." I mean, I thought I just pilloried these people, but they just like people who write about them and what they do. So anyway, George Stevens and Giant, one of our favorite films, nailed the oil depletion allowance, and Kennedy was against it too. And I mean, all these things in my mind tie together in my study of American history, and that's what I like about researching films and history and culture and literature and journalism. It's all a continuum, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the book is called I Loved Movies, and it just came out. Again, you could pick it up at stickingplacebooks.com. That's stickingplacebooks.com. We'll leave the link at the bottom of the screen here, as well as the description. You can also pick it up at barnesandnoble.com and amazon.com. Also, it is available if you would like to instantly stream it on their Audible program on there too. So, Eli, do you have anything else you'd like to add before we close the show out tonight?
I don't think so. I just want to say thanks again. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, guys. Your questions were wonderful, and thank you for having me on for more than 2 hours. A great conversation. The time zipped by because it's so interesting talking to you.
Absolutely. And we would hope to have you on again sometime, maybe here in the beginning of next year. That'd be fantastic. I mean, you've been a wealth of knowledge, and it's really been an honor, Joe.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it very much. And anytime you want me back, I'll be happy to do it.
Oh, thank you so much. All right. And to our audience, the truth is out there. You take care. We'll see you in the next episode.